Chapter 7. It was still night when Blue awoke. The stars were brilliant outside the little window. Prowling around, he found a faint draft of air coming in under a lower wallboard. Quickly he began to dig, ripping with teeth and claws. Soon his shoulders were under the wallboard, and the earth beyond was crumbling around his head. With a last savage effort, he clawed and pushed his way through and stood upright on the outside. Silk and the Boundary Rider's other dogs began barking wildly. They sensed that Blue was somewhere in the darkness, free of the shed. In the shack, a light showed as Kim and his father awoke. The light was moving along the veranda, and Kim's father was shouting at the dogs when Blue loped away. Ears pricked, he peered ahead. Somewhere there might be the glow of a campfire. The old man might be stretched, sleeping in his blankets. Behind at the shed, Kim was peering sadly at the tunneled hole. His father stood nearby, staring into the darkness. After some time, Blue eased his pace to a trot, then to a slow, ambling walk. The water and rest had given him some strength, but he needed meat. Toward dawn he flopped down to rest near a clump of spindly scrub. In full light he rose to follow an old disused cattle pad. It was meandering and faint, almost obliterated by wind-blown dust, and came to an end in the eroded soil around an old broken trough. Nearby were the remnants of a windmill sagging above a filled-in well. At some time the water stream far below had run dry. The well had been abandoned to rust and crumble away in desolation. Blue clawed in the dust near the trough, but there was no scent of water. After wandering around, he trotted away to continue his search. It was night when he reached a ridge that overlooked a long, sloping depression. Pausing briefly to stare, he suddenly began to run, almost choking with excitement. Down in the depression, a campfire burned brightly. Its flickering flames cast an arc of light. Outlined in the glow were several men. Blue was close when he anxiously raised his nostrils. Whimpering, he came to a halt. There was no old man, only the scent of strangers. They were stockmen camped for the night on a mustering job. Their horses were nearby, tethered to picket lines. A number of saddles were stacked on the ground. Blue crouched and lay watching all night. One by one he saw the men go to sleep, covered over by their blankets. Then the stars waxed and waned, until at last the men awoke. Some saddled the horses, others did varying chores. The fire flared up brightly as all squatted down to eat. Blue heard them talking, but the words were unfamiliar. So too were the voices. After the men had eaten and drunk, they rode away. Soon they were gone beyond a distant scrub clump. All that remained was a long, drifting trail of dust. Warily, Blue crept down to the camp. He scented where the men had slept, then wolfed the few scraps of meat and damper that had been thrown in the ashes. Afterward, he found a cattle trail along which the men had traveled the day before and followed it. Near noon, he left the trail and trotted across country again. He was limping along when suddenly he raised his head. Away to the west he saw a flight of birds, white against the sky. They were cockatoos heading for water. Their flight was purposeful as they flew in unison. Blue followed them until they faded in the darkening sky. Then he traveled by instinct along the path of their flight. Near midnight he reached a giant windmill, turning slowly in the breeze. Water was splashing from the mill's outlet pipe into a big reservoir. Clustered around the nearby troughs were a number of shadowy cattle drinking thirstily. They scented Blue as he crept near. Some snorted, rattling their horns on the troughs. Some bellowed, pawing dust. Then the whole herd bolted, leaving Blue alone. After drinking, he crawled under one of the troughs to sleep. It was shadowy there, darker than the surrounding night. Toward dawn, Blue crouched on his haunches. His hackles rose as he scented the strong, bitter tang of wild dogs. Then he saw them, lean, panting brutes, reeking with the smell of blood. They had killed somewhere. Their eyes glowed, reflecting the starlight as one after the other. They leaped up into the trough to drink, then jumped down again. When all had drunk, they crept toward Blue. He felt their hard, cruel muzzles scenting him all over. Had they smelt the taint of man, they would have torn Blue to shreds, but there was none. Sun, dust, and water had scoured away all scent of the old man and Kim. Yet the wild dogs knew that Blue was not of their breed. They sensed he was different, and bunched together, shoulder to shoulder in a circle, as if discussing him. Then the leader pointed his muzzle to the sky and howled. It was a long, sobbing cry, eerie and chilling. When it ended, the other dogs answered in chorus. The leader slashed around with his jaws, and the bitten dogs whined. Then there was silence, ghostly and still, as the pack slunk away. Blue quivered, suddenly released from his crouching tension, and followed. There was a freshness in him from the water, but his belly ached for food. He traveled slowly, scenting the paw marks scratched in the dust. He knew the wild dogs were ahead, and he knew too that there was meat. As yet he couldn't smell it, but instinct told him it was there. The dogs had left it to drink. Now they had gone back. Blue padded warily, scenting every odor. Soon he knew he was near the dogs, near the meat too. His jaws slavered as he crept in behind some scrub. In the gray light he could just see the dogs gathered around a carcass. It was that of a calf, left alone while its mother went in to drink. Now she had returned to find her young dead. With lowered head and moaning bawl, She kept charging the dogs, trying to drive them away. But the dogs were insolent. They snapped at the cow and sent her reeling. Finally she fled, outnumbered by the vicious pack. The dogs returned from chasing the cow and gnawed at the carcass again. After some time, they left in single file, following the big leader. Blue saw them pad slowly up a distant rise, then disappear from view. Far off he heard the sound of a truck, but took no notice, aware only of the fact that he must eat or die. He ran down to the carcass, wolfing whatever meat was on the bones. He heard the sounds of distant shots, but again took no notice. His one intent was to eat until his belly was full. He was nearly sated when at last he raised his head. The sound of the truck was coming nearer. So too were the sounds of several more shots. Instinct warned Blue of danger, but the sudden relief from hunger was too great. He ripped at the carcass again, snuffling for more meat. Then Blue heard the gasping, straining sounds of dogs in full flight. He wheeled as two dogs sped past. One was the pack leader. The other, trailing behind, was dragging a broken leg. Neither dog looked at Blue. Each was intent on some distant goal where he could hide in safety. The truck Blue had heard came into view, hurtling down the distant slope. It was near when it swerved to a stop. A man shouted, "There's another one, but shoot the lame one first." Blue saw the glint of a rifle. As if goaded, he leaped over the carcass into full stride. He heard the rifle crackle and instinctively glanced back. The lame dog was inert, sprawled on the ground. Ahead, the leader was still in wild, desperate flight. The truck started up again, but Blue barely heard. His ears were flattened close to his head as he raced for the nearest scrub. He was slobbering for breath, weaving between some scrubby timber, when he heard the rifle again. It sounded faint and far away, as if death had come to another. And there was no more fear, no more pain, no more heartbreak, only the great bush quietness whispering in the dust. Blue slowed to a tired, loping walk and panted for air. His tongue lolled as he sucked in great mouthfuls. Ahead, scrub lay in denser thickets, where pools of shade darkened the ground. Blue was laboring up another slight rise toward the shade when he heard the truck again. This time it was so close that it was already lurching over scrub not far behind him. The driver had driven slowly and quietly so that his mate could search around. Blue spurted for the denser scrub as the truck jolted to a halt. A voice shouted, "Put one in 'em and we've got the lot." The voice tones were urgent, vibrant with threat. Frantically, Blue spurted into a twisting, weaving stride, but the man was an expert marksman. Blue heard two thuds in the ground near him as the rifle crackled twice. Then the rifle sounded again, and Blue felt a raw, searing pain along his ribs. The impact was glancing, yet of great force. It bowled him over and over, yelping with pain. Regaining his feet, he lunged for the scrub. Within moments he was weaving between thick stems that hurt his side but gave him shelter. Behind, a voice shouted, "We'll never reach him in there, but it don't matter. You got him, sure as anything." Another voice answered, "Ah, I don't know. It wasn't clean. I should go in and finish 'em." The voice held more of sadness than a wish to kill, as if the man was sorry now that the excitement was over. The truck engine roared as the first voice shouted, "Don't let it worry her. Someone has to do it. Come on, let's go." The sound of engine and voices died away as Blue plunged deeper and deeper into the scrub. Soon there were no other sounds than the rustle of twigs and branches as he pushed through them. Finally he sprawled in a little clearing and licked his wound. It was long and thin, just grooved along the skin, but deep enough to bleed. Blue lay for a long time, licking the wound until at last it was clean. Then he rose to travel on and find water. The fierce chase had parched him. He needed water as badly as he had the previous day. Toward evening he left the dense scrub behind and padded across wide, dusty plains. Here and there small, spindly trees sprouted up their bony branches, and Blue stared eagerly. They were trees the old man would have chosen. Under them was the wood for a fire and the comfort of a camp. But there was no old man, no brown, withered hands to nuzzle or see standing a billy in the fire, no hoarse, whispery voice to say, "Come here, Blue, I'll put some sulphur on yer. That scar of yourn needs dressin'." There was no voice, nothing, only the dryness of thirst, and a vast and lonely landscape. Blue lowered his head and padded on. Somewhere a fire would glitter. Somewhere the worn, battered hat would be filled with water. Instinct drove Blue on. Somewhere, sometime, was all that mattered. The old man would be there, waiting. As the sun went down, flaring red on the skyline, Blue found the fresh tracks of horses. He followed them in deepening shadow until at last he saw lights ahead. They were the lights of a homestead, gleaming behind square-curtained windows. Beyond the homestead and a cluster of outbuildings was a windmill. Horses nickered or fed in a high-railed stockyard. Stiff from his wound, Blue crept in a wide circle. He scented dogs chained near some sheds. The dogs would be alert, keen to scent strangers, but Blue was downwind, scenting but not being scented. He reached a trough near the windmill and drank quickly. A chicken squawked not far away. After several moments the chicken squawked again, and a rooster clucked impatiently. Blue scented a goanna, searching for eggs or prowling from habit near the poultry roost. Suddenly a door opened on the homestead veranda, and a man stood in the shaft of light. He had a shotgun in his hands. After peering around, he half turned as he said, "There's something out here worryin' the fowls. I wouldn't mind bettin' it's that dog Clarkson's men missed. He was tellin' me tonight on the phone that one got away." He straightened his stance to peer out into the darkness again. Blue saw the shotgun gleam as it was half raised. From inside the room a woman's voice called, "You and a wild dog." It couldn't have traveled this far in the time. Come in and close the door. It's that old goanna again, stooping amongst the hens. Her voice was soft, soothing almost, and the man went inside, closing the door. There was a quietness then, and Blue lay down to rest, head on paws. He watched and scented carefully, knowing that danger was near. His side ached where the bullet had plowed a furrow. There were other rifles, other men, especially in nearby buildings. Their dogs, too, were enemies. As time passed, lights in the homestead dimmed. One after the other they went out. Soon there was only darkness where the windows had gleamed. Rising to his haunches, Blue crept away. A loneliness greater than in the surrounding bush was in the darkened buildings. He reached a sandstone ridge and lay, head on paws, waiting for daylight. When it came, he stared toward the homestead. He saw men about, and a wisp of smoke coming from a chimney. He scented far, raising his head high, and knew that a man moving toward the kitchen was carrying meat. Several dogs, restless on their chains, barked spasmodically. Blue sensed that they in turn had smelled the meat or scented him. He rose stiffly, stretching to ease the pain in his side. Before padding away, he glanced around. Suddenly he braced, ears pricked and alert. Far off, feathering a trail of dust, a truck was coming. Its engine droned, faint and barely heard, as if a bee were trapped in some vast dome. Blue crouched again, waiting. There was an ominous note in the sound of the truck. When it was near, it swung in toward the windmill and stopped outside a building opposite the homestead. Two men clambered down from the truck to lean against its mudguards. They were the men who had hunted Blue the day before. The truck was the one they had driven. A man came from the outbuilding carrying a rifle. He clambered onto the back of the truck, where he was joined by one of the other two men. He too carried a rifle. The third man slid in behind the steering wheel, ready to drive away. Blue heard the engine roar, then die to a soft whine as another man came onto the homestead veranda. It was the man Blue had seen the night before with a shotgun in his hands. The man shouted, "Now, don't forget, he's bound to make back to water, back to the windmill near where you shot the others. You shouldn't have left him yesterday until you saw him dead." His voice sounded impatient, angry that a job started hadn't been finished properly. The truck driver shouted, "Don't worry, we'll leave 'em this time dead as they come. Clarkson was mad as a snake when we got home last night." The man on the veranda shouted, "Well, now, I'm mad too. You chased 'em onto my property, then left him. That's about the last card in the pack." He turned and went back into the homestead, leaving the door to slam shut behind him. Other men in the stockyards, saddling horses, paused to look up as the truck drove away. There was menace in the two men crouching on its back, menace too in the glint of their rifles. Blue sank low, burying down behind a rock. It was crumbly and soft, weathered by time. He sensed that danger was all around. It had been in the men's voices. Now it was in the truck speeding away across country. Soon it would be in the men mounting their horses. Pressed close to the rock, Blue watched and waited. Instinct told him to be still. To run would bring him within sight of the horsemen now leaving the stockyards. Talking and laughing, the men rode toward the windmill. Some had freed their dogs, and the animals trotted behind, eager for the day's work. The stockmen were heading in the opposite direction to the truck to muster cattle. They had ridden past the windmill when several of the dogs discovered Blue's scent. They crowded about the trough, anxiously scenting the ground. One found where Blue had left and began to follow. A stockman turned back and cracked his whip. "Come in behind," he shouted, "or I'll flay your hides. You ain't got a chance of findin' that old goanna." He cracked his whip again, driving the dogs from Blue's scent. As if puzzled, the dogs obeyed, yet kept glancing back over their shoulders. Within moments the stockmen spurred their horses into a canter. Soon the only sign of men, dogs, and horses was a drifting cloud of dust. Blue lay for a long time, watching the homestead and buildings. Occasionally a dog left behind barked, or a man showed walking between the buildings. As the sun rose higher, heat shimmered on the sandstone. From afar a herd of horses came stringing in to water. There was a somnolence about them as they clustered around the troughs. Above them the windmill sails hung lifeless without wind. It was nearing noon when Blue rose and shook the dust from his coat. Creeping wearily, he left the ridge. After slinking down a slight slope, he reached an old cattle trail that eventually led him to a great stretch of plain. Across it were some scattered clumps of timber. Amongst the trees, Blue scented from one lean, spindly trunk to another. There was wood on the ground, dead branches on the trunks, but no fire. No old man crouched over a steaming billy. No hoarse, whispery tones sang, "This'll do us, Blue," or "Take a look around while I boil the billy." Blue sighed as the last tree was passed and he trotted on. Toward nightfall he saw a great herd of cattle backed by the sunset. They were being bedded down by their drovers. The men were singing in low, soothing voices as they encircled the herd. Some of the cattle were already on the ground. Others were standing chewing their cuds. The drovers sang mournfully, hunched in their saddles. Their horses slouched, weary from the great distances. Over all was the fading glare of the sunset. Its crimson glow stained men and animals alike. Circling wide of the drovers and their cattle, Blue saw their campfire. Around it, several men were already eating. Their horses were nearby, tied to a tree, ready to be ridden on night watch. From far off came the sound of horse bells as the remainder of the drovers' horses grazed. Near them would be the horse-tailor, stretching out to sleep for the night. Blue sensed it all and scented far, raising his muzzle high. There was no old man, no welcoming voice, only cattle, horses, and sweaty men smelling strongly of horses. Blue sighed and lowered his head. Reaching a small depression, he crawled in amongst some tussocks. Dry with thirst, he lay there staring toward the fire. There was comfort in the distant flickering flames. In them was the smell of cooking meat and baking damper, mixed with that of steaming tea. Blue's jaws sagged, his tongue lolled, too dry to swallow. As the hours passed, Blue saw men come and go. They either rode in from the cattle or rode out to them. The night watch shifts were of 2 hours each, and the men had little sleep. All through the night their mournful voices droned around the cattle. Near daylight a man threw aside his blankets and kicked the glowing fire embers together. It was the cook, beginning to prepare breakfast. The meal was quick, over almost before it started. As blankets were rolled, the distant horses were brought into the camp by the horse tailor. While he ate, other men threw pack saddles on the biggest horses. Soon the pack saddles were loaded. After the men had changed night watch saddle horses for fresh ones, the horse tailor drove his herd from the camp. As they strung out ahead, the cattle began to follow. Behind them the drovers rode, a slouch in their saddles. Some rolled cigarettes, others glanced about them. Their eyes were attuned to searching, yet no man saw Blue. Daylight failed to betray him. His body was merged with the clumps of drooping tussock grass. Even his keen-pricked ears were hidden. Busy about the fire, the cook gathered utensils and stowed them on a pack-horse. Next to it, a saddle-horse fidgeted, keen to follow its mates. After a final glance around, the cook kicked dust over the fire, then rolled a cigarette. It was alight when he mounted the saddle-horse. Leading the pack-horse, he rode away. There was a quietness then until at last Blue moved. Keeping low to the ground, he crept to the smothered fire. Its dust-covered ashes were still hot when he muzzled amongst them for scraps. He found pieces of burned meat and damper and wolfed them. They hurt when he swallowed, but he gulped them down. After further search, he found some relief in a buried jam tin. Its inside was coated with a sugary sweetness that soothed his parched tongue. He licked the inside until it shone. Finding nothing more, he dozed in the warmth of the slowly rising sun. Several hours passed. In them was the quietness of the old man, hunched by a fire. Water was there too, in the old battered hat. It was brimming, running over in wasted streams, and there was a hoarse, whispery voice sang, "Come on, Blue, we'll push on, mate, to see what's over the skyline." Blue rose and stretched stiffly. His body was tight, shrunken with thirst. Leaving the camp behind, he trotted after the drovers. When he drew near, he circled wide, slinking low to the ground, as he trotted through the scrub. As he passed, the cattle were strung out in long, meandering lines. All walked as if inured to their slow, rolling rhythm. Around them their drovers rode singly. Some were asleep in their saddles. They sat slumped, only held in the stirrups by instinct or by an occasional push from a mate. Blue was past the great herd when he saw the horse-tailor ahead. He was small in the distance, and the loose horses he drove were strung out similarly to the cattle. Many were out of Blue's sight. The country was changing again to sandy scrub-covered ridges. Gradually Blue lessened the distance. Soon he was padding not far behind the horse-tailor and his horses. Amongst them were all the pack animals, carrying the drover's gear. The tailor was young, little more than a boy. His body had a square-shouldered swing whenever he turned to ride after a straying horse. Blue watched and stayed hidden, weaving his way through the scrub. He scented water somewhere amongst the horses, yet there was no windmill or trough, no water-hole or seepage trickling down rocks, only a vagrant scent that shifted and changed, sometimes from one direction, sometimes from another. Blue gasped from the dryness, swelling his tongue, and repeatedly raised his muzzle. Water was there, somewhere, but where? Then the tailor rode alongside a bulkily laden pack-horse, and slid to the ground. He caught the animal by its mane, and he said, "Hold still, Baldy, while I take a drink. This heat would fry a man." Stooping down, the tailor drank from a water bag, strapped to the animal's neck. In addition to the bag, the horse carried 2 big, flat-sided water tanks, both holding 10 gallons, and hanging one each side of the padded pack saddle. The tailor straightened and wiped his lips. As he went to remount his own horse, he saw Blue creeping near. The yearning was too great. Blue needed water. His raw tongue lolled, sagging from his mouth. There was a wildness in his eyes as they stared at the dripping water bag. The scent was there, seeping from the moist canvas. Then madness came. Sobbing for breath, Blue leaped forward. His jaws ripped the water bag, and it flooded open. Water cascaded over his head, but little went into his mouth. He fell on his side and struggled up. Frantically he licked at whatever the water had splashed, but to no avail. It had gone, soaked into the dust. All that remained was the moistness darkening the ground. As if suddenly freed, the tailor ran around the pack-horse to another that had halted nearby. A rifle poked out from its load, and the tailor tried to jerk the weapon free. Its butt jammed, caught in a rope. The tailor cursed, pulling wildly on the barrel. "So help me," he shouted, trying to hold the horse as well as pull on the rifle. You wouldn't read about it. A wild dog gone mad, and the rifle stuck, as well as a busted water bag. Finally, he jerked the rifle free. Blue heard the voice and saw the rifle. He sensed danger and bitter, searing pain. The wild, slobbering madness left him as he leaped away amongst the horses. Some kicked at him, some snorted and plunged from his path. Blue had left all the animals behind when he glanced back over his shoulders. The tailor was running, with the rifle in his hands. Sobbing for breath, Blue spurted to reach the safety of denser scrub. The rifle sounded twice. He saw two puffs of dust ahead of him, and heard two muffled thuds. Then there was silence, as he raced through tall, concealing scrub. There was relief, too, from the brassy, flaring sun. Gradually Blue slowed to a weary, wavering trot. His legs faltered, yet he staggered on. Somewhere there was water. Somewhere the old man was hunched by a fire. His lined face was smiling as he whispered, "This'll do us, Blue, as snug as anywhere." The hoarseness was there, so too was the water in the dished-in hat, and food in the brown, withered hands. Blue forced his way on. The scrub pulled at him, and the dryness burned his throat. He was tottering from leg to leg when he scented water. His nostrils quivered, sucking in the scent through congealed dust. At last he came to the peak of a ridge, and the water was below. Near it were a snake and a goanna fighting a battle to the death. Neither paused nor looked at Blue as he staggered past to fall into the water-hole, a tiny pool sheltered from the sun by an overhanging ledge of sandstone rock. Blue drank until his belly was distended. Then he pawed his head and eyes until they were clean. Afterward he lay for a long time, with his paws resting in the water. Behind him the goanna had defeated the snake and was swallowing it. Its tail was swinging from side to side in the goanna's mouth. The big lizard finally gulped, and the snake was gone. His conqueror waddled away to sleep in the shade. Presently, as strength came back, Blue scented around for scraps, but there were none. No men had camped at the water-hole for a long, long time. There were some old rust-crumbled tins buried in the dust, and nothing else. Even though starving, Blue left the goanna alone. Its flesh was repugnant, and Blue sensed the goanna's strength would be greater than his own. Finally Blue slept, sprawled in the shadow of the sandstone ledge. The scent of kangaroo woke him. As his eyes slowly opened, he saw four bounding from one squatting position to another as they peered at him. They were inquisitive, yet weary. A big, fight-scarred old man kangaroo suddenly leaped close. Chattering fiercely, it wheeled and smashed a blow at Blue with its tail. Caught unawares, Blue was almost stunned, but managed to lope away and find another sandstone ledge to crouch under. There was no fight in him now, only a great tiredness and a longing for the old man. The hurt was there, where the blow had struck, but that was all. When the kangaroos had drunk, they began to fight. They were big, heavy-shouldered bucks, but the fighting, scarred leader was supreme. He cuffed, kicked, and swung his great tail until the others bounded away. Then he bounded after them. His body was upright and arrogant as it disappeared from view. Creeping down from the ledge, Blue sprawled again near the waterhole. There was comfort in the scent of water close to his nostrils. He sighed as the setting sun flared, angling across the waterhole. Somewhere the old man would be camping under a tree. Somewhere a fire would be gleaming. There would be food from the withered old hands and water from the hat. Blue sighed again, stretching stiffly. His eyelids closed, shutting out the sadness that came with night. Toward dawn he drank for the last time, then left the waterhole. Instinct told him he was dying from starvation and the ache within. He needed the old man, but there was no old man, only the great loneliness of the vast and dusty landscape. Chapter 8. By noon, Blue could barely walk. He was rolling from side to side, straining to keep on all four paws. The heat from the high brassy sky seared the cracked barren ground. Then Blue reached a track, two ribbon-like dust-covered ruts stretching from one hazy distance into another. There was a sense of familiarity when he turned eastward and began to stumble blindly along. Near sunset he topped a slight rise. Barely able to see, he peered ahead to where the hazed brown land was darkening. At first he saw only the faint, dust-covered ruts receding into the distance. Then his eyes blurred, and he scuffed them with a paw. When he peered again, he whimpered brokenly. He had gone full circle. The gray split trunk was not far ahead. Near its base a fire burned brightly. Hunched close by, the old man was staring into the flames. His swag was behind him. So was the Billy and Tucker bag. Two choked to whimper again. Blue tottered into a run. His legs failed him, and he fell, but he rose and stumbled on again. He was almost within reach when he halted, trembling, and the old man turned around. For long moments man and dog peered at each other. Then the old man held out his arms, and Blue crept into them. His parched, dusty jaws nuzzled the brown, withered skin, and the old man sobbed. Presently he whispered, "I knew you'd come as sure as anything. I've been waitin', Blue, waitin' and waitin'." He stared down at Blue, studying him closely. Blood had congealed on the long, grooved scar, and Blue's ribs showed bony under the shaggy skin. His eyes, too, were raw between their dust-coated lids. Scuffing the tears from his own eyes, the old man said, "They shot at yer like I thought they would. You're right now, mate, and with me to the end." Taking the ragged towel from his swag, he wiped Blue all over, then dusted the wound with sulphur. It showed yellow as Blue sprawled down by the fire. His eyes glowed, reflecting the firelight, as they gazed at the old man. Slowly the old man took off his hat and reached for the billy. He poured water into the dished-in crown before he said, "Yes, mate, we're together for ever and ever. I can feel it in my bones." Blue drank, while the old man pulled meat and damper from the Tucker bag. To the west, a scarlet flare of sunset stained the sky. After cutting off several slices of meat, the old man passed them to Blue. They were small slices, thinly cut, and Blue wolfed them down. They were gone within moments, barely touching his teeth. Standing by the billy in the flames, the old man stood back to wait for it to boil. There was so much he wanted to say, yet for the moment he couldn't speak. Gradually, the reaction from seeing Blue took effect. The relief was too great, and suddenly the old man clutched his chest. A pain seared through him, doubling him over. Anxious-eyed, Blue rose to his haunches. Inch by inch, he crept forward until at last he could nuzzle the old withered hands. Love and a sad, wistful yearning was in the touch, and slowly the old man straightened. Forcing himself upright, he fondled Blue's ears. Neither man nor dog moved then until the billy boiled. When the tea was made, the old man leaned back against the stump as he said, "Now, mate, I'll tell you all that's happened." He sipped a mouthful of tea, and Blue sighed, resting his head down. "Yeah," the old man said, "I was knocked flat out, the same as you, the morning Mad Mick hit us. Only with me it was different. He took me on to where them prospectors was waitin', and there me head cleared. I wanted to come back. Mad Mick and the other two wanted to take me on. In all that wind I couldn't make sense, so they took me on." He sipped another mouthful of tea and wiped his eyes. "We reached Nandura Station, you know, the one where the dogs took to us, and the boss and his daughter wanted to buy her." His hand rested for a moment on Blue's shoulders, stroking the shaggy fur, "and they wanted to take me on to the hospital in Waruna, but I told them no, that you were my mate, and I had to find yer. If you were dead, I'd bury yer. If not, we'd push on. So they brought a doctor to me. While he was around, they slipped out to look for yer. When they got back, they told me you were alive, and that was enough for me." "I started to walk, and soon they caught up with me and brought me here in their car. I've been here ever since, Blue, watchin' and waitin'. They've been out too several times to bring me some tucker and look for you. They said they were comin' again." He ended tiredly, glad there was no more to say. Rising stiffly, he stood the billy down and unrolled his swag. Stretching out on the worn, tattered blankets, he pulled Blue to him again. The sky had darkened, speckled with stars. "We'll get some sleep," he whispered, "then push on. I can hardly wait. Just you and me walkin' on." He half sat up, then lay down again. "There's always tomorrow, Blue, ain't there? Especially now you're back." His voice questioned, as if demanding an answer, but there was no answer, only the soft sighing sound of Blue's indrawn breath. The old man heard and smiled before falling asleep. Numbed with tiredness and pain, Blue closed his eyes. He lay for a long time dozing sleepily. When he opened his eyes again, the fire was still burning brightly. Slithering over the old man's feet was a snake. Its head glittered evilly, lit by the dancing flames. Blue stared as the hackles rose on his neck. Instinct told him to leap, but his muscles were too stiff. Gradually he began to brace as the snake changed direction. It had been slithering toward the fire. Now it writhed toward the old man's hand, outflung in the dust. Near it was the billy, containing a small drop of tea. The snake was thirsty and scented the moisture. Suddenly the old man sighed. His hand twitched, stirring the dust, and the snake reared to strike, its head poised rigidly, and Blue leaped, floundering over the old man. Then snake and dog met, reeling in mid-air. Coiled together, they rolled over and over until at last Blue gripped the snake's neck. Within moments the coils sank lifeless by the fire. Wearily, Blue crept back to the old man's side. The old man hadn't moved, even when Blue leaped over him. His seamed face was calm, as if he had gone where there was no more tomorrow, only a wild, flaring sunset into which he and Blue were heading. Blue sighed and licked his wound. It was sore where he had rolled on the snake, and the snake had bitten. Slowly but surely, Blue lowered his head, warm in the comfort of the old tattered blankets. Soon he was asleep, hushed in a great quietness. The fire dimmed, crumbling into ash. Above, in the darkness, towered the gray, split stump.